Welcome to the British Library. Tonight's event is in partnership with the Royal Society of Literature and is part of a series accompanying the smash hit and critically acclaimed exhibition Medieval Women. I'm here in the exhibition right now and I'm with one of them, Marie de France. This is a collection item of her writing, and you're about to get to know her a whole lot better thanks to the inimitable Lauren Groff and her book Matrix, which we'll be exploring here tonight. There'll be time for questions later, so please do get those ready. And you'll see that the books are also available online. Guiding us through tonight's conversation is Stephanie Merritt. Stephanie is the author of 14 books, and you might know her as S.J. Parris, the name on her best-selling Elizabethan historical crime series, which has sold over 1 million copies in the UK. Stephanie used to be the deputy literary editor for The Observer, and she writes and broadcasts and presents about books pretty much all over the place. Her new novel, which is a Bruno spin-off, is called Traitor's Legacy, and it's out in May. Over to you, Stephanie.
Good evening and welcome to this British Library online event. I'm Stephanie Merritt, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce you to Lauren Groff this evening. Lauren is the best-selling author of 5 novels and 2 collections of stories. She's a 3-time National Book Award finalist, and she was named one of Granta's Best Young American Novelists in 2017. She's also the co-founder of an independent bookshop, The Links, in Gainesville, Florida. And we are here to talk about her 4th novel, Matrix, which is a fictionalized life of the 12th century poet Marie de France. So, Lauren, welcome to the British Library.
Thank you.
Thanks
it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, I wish you were here in person, but it's lovely to talk to you. So I'd like to go right back to the origins of Matrix. It was your follow-up to Fates and Furies, which was a contemporary story of a marriage, a novel that won enormous acclaim and was famously Barack Obama's Book of the Year in 2015, and it catapulted you into a level of literary stardom. What drew you to follow it with such a markedly different theme, these lives of medieval women in a religious community?
Well, I think the Trump years were really deeply metabolized in me. And I was working on another book, actually my most recent book, The Vaster Wilds, when I had this beautiful fellowship at Radcliffe, which is, now a subsidiary of Harvard. And really, it's like a dream for someone like me, a dilettante's dream, because I didn't really have to do anything but give a lecture and then listen to these geniuses in history, in geology, in physics, speak about the things that they're really passionate about. And so once a week, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to write a novel about black holes, right? Or, oh my goodness, I need to write about Haiti. But my friend, Dr. Katie Bookish, who is a medieval scholar at Notre Dame, stood up one day and she gave this really impassioned speech about medieval nuns. And as I was sitting in the audience, I flashed back to my absolute love of medieval French and to Marie de France in particular. And I knew I actually almost had a secular vision coming down into me of what the book would actually look like. So I realized that I was writing The Vaster Wilds and Matrix as the first and second part of a larger triptych. It's not a trilogy. Everything's very different, but it's a triptych. So I think going back to my original answer, I really just wanted to live in a world of women. I really, my joke with my friends through the Trump years is that we were just going to buy an island off the coast of Florida and make a lesbian separatist community. We didn't want any men. And in my household as well, I have 2 sons and a husband. So, the virility is strong here. So it was a way of escaping, of dealing with contemporary issues without necessarily having to stay in the contemporary world.
And I want to come back to that idea of this utopian community of women, because as we find out in the novel, it's not perhaps as ideal as we might imagine it to be. All these communities all have their flaws. I wonder, has that dream been revived I feel like when you're saying the Trump years, we now have to say the first Trump years. I can't believe
Oh
we're
no.
even having to say that.
I'm so heartbroken. Yeah, no, you're right. Yes. Yes. And I think it'll become a reality this time.
Yeah.
Yes.
So tell us about your relationship with Marie de France's writing, because I think you'd encountered her as an undergraduate, is that right? And
Yes.
what was it that drew you to the historical Marie and her particular type of poetry?
Well, I took this beautiful tutorial with Professor Dr. Rockwell at Amherst College, and because I don't do well in large group situations, the tutorial system is my thing. I asked him if we could just study medieval French, and if I could go into Ancien Français and learn how to read it and learn how to write it. At that time, I thought I was going to be a medieval scholar. My loves, they batter about the world at all times, and very much excited about everything. So for a full year, actually, we studied medieval French. And of course, when you study Ancien Français, you tend to see a lot of narratives by men, over and over, because who had the education, who had the time, who had, the beautiful history of precursors to look at and to follow. So suddenly on my docket came Marie de France, and I'd never read of her before. I'd never even heard of her. I studied for a year in France in between high school and college, and I'd never known of her. And I was blown away because the lay, these beautiful, very weird bits of poetry that tell stories that are based on Breton stories, they're just so marvelous, right? They're full of strangeness. They're full of surprisingly modern ideas. They're full of imagery that's just profound and spectacularly beautiful. And I was in love with French, but I really fell in love with French then, especially the original French of Marie de France. Of course, she probably was in England when she was writing these, but I carried her with me for years and years and years. And in fact, I tried to write another novel long ago about her, but it was really very serious. And I think because she's so strange and her mind is so strange. I mean, there's a queer werewolf story in the lay. You can't meet someone like Marie de France with seriousness, right? It has to be very playful. Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested because there are some questions over the identity of the writer whose works have come down to us as Marie de France. And one of the contenders is Marie, who was Abbess of Shaftesbury. And you've obviously chosen to go with that view of her identity and sort of bring those two worlds together in a sense. Was there evidence for the life of Marie, the Abbess of Shaftesbury, who was the illegitimate half-sister of Henry II? And what kind of evidence did you find to bring those two people together and assume and conclude that that was the person you were going to write about?
The beautiful thing and the challenge was that there is nothing really known about her, of course, right? I mean, there are suppositions, and academics feel very passionately about who she was, and she may have been Marie of Shaftesbury. To be honest, I was trying to strike a middle ground. So yes, the Abbey in the book is something like Shaftesbury, but it's definitely not Shaftesbury, right? So it's a little bit of an imagined place in a slightly different location in England, and the scope of the life is slightly different. And so I did steal from Marie of Shaftesbury, but I didn't really target her exactly, right? It was a little bit to the side, because if I'm already imagining the life of this person, and I'm already imagining such wild things that are going on that almost certainly did not happen in the life of Marie of Shaftesbury, why would I actually peg it on this specific person? So I loved the idea. I think that there's a very compelling case to be made that she definitely had a link to Henry, and it because she dedicated the lay, to him. So I'm not quite sure. I didn't want to be definitive. I just wanted to be playful about it. Yeah.
And so what kind of research did you do when you were embarking on the novel, looking into these female religious communities? And I wonder if you made any kind of surprising discoveries about the lives of these women.
Oh, there's so many beautiful things, right? As you know, medieval scholars are brilliant and they know so much, and there's so much that they dig up all the time. I'm not a scholar. I just sort of read as much as I possibly can and try to integrate it into my mind. There's this great American writer named Catherine Davis who wrote a lot of very brilliant books, but she wrote this one book about Versailles, and it's called Versailles. And I once heard the way that she integrated all of the historical research that she did on Versailles. And what she did is that she had these files and files and files of facts. And if she had actually spent all of her time sort of living within these facts and these files, she never would have written the book itself, right? So she actually had to divorce herself from that in order to write the book. And so what I did was I gave myself a limited amount of time, about a year, to do as much research as possible. I did primary source reading as much as I possibly could have, but mostly secondary source, right? And I had a lot of conversations with Dr. Bookish about everything under the sun that could have been a possibility. And I read a great deal about mystics, medieval mystics, and I went into their lives and into their mysticism, and it's such a profoundly beautiful thing to live in, a crystalline, in a very real way. And I think the thing that surprised me most and kept surprising and delighting me is that the people of the time, I think that we think of them as so distant from us, but a sense of humor popped up all over the place. There's so much humor and strangeness and beauty. I love these, and they're all over the internet, but in medieval manuscripts, there are these beautiful little cartoons. What are they called again? You can remind me.
You mean the marginalia? Or
they write the marginalia, but there's a specific writer which it's escaping me right now. But they're
drolleries. Is that right?
Drolleries. That's it. Yes, drolleries. Yeah, but they're dirty. Right? They're scatological. Right? They're funny. They're strange. They're
there's a lot of genitalia growing on trees, and that's
so much genitalia. Absolutely, yes. So it sort of blew up my understanding, or my false understanding of what the Middle Ages were, right? Because we're given a very flat narrative of that time. We're given Monty Python, whom I love. They're very funny also, but it's very clearly cheeky. It's very clearly speaking out of the 20th century. And here are these people with evidence all over the place of being just as rich and deep and interesting and convoluted and strange as we are now.
I think one of the things that I found so interesting from your novel, but also from the current exhibition in the British Library, is just the extraordinary competence of women in the Middle Ages, because particularly in these religious communities, you've got women trained in all the trades because they have to make the day-to-day practical life of the Abbey work, but also these extraordinary intellectual and financial talents. And there was a detail that I really loved that I think I must have seen you talk about in a previous interview about the book, but you've got this character, Sister Githa, who is the illustrator, who is slightly mad, but she's a brilliant artist. And she's always got blue teeth. And I wondered if you could tell us about where that detail came from.
Yes, that came directly from Dr. Katie Bookish's lecture the very first time I started thinking about Matrix, and it was sort of delivered to me. Apparently, in Germany, archaeologists had dug up the teeth of a medieval nun, and they were blue, and they were thinking it was because of the lapis lazuli of painting. Maybe it was some sort of medicine that she was taking, or she was licking the paintbrush, and that countermanded a lot of the understanding of who got to make art, who got to make sacred art. All right, for a long time, it had been believed that only monks, only men were allowed to make these texts that were sacred. And this idea of this nun being able to paint these beautiful illuminations in manuscripts, that changed that narrative. And I thought that was so interesting and extraordinary to think of, these pious women doing this sacred work.
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary. And I think, as you mentioned, there is quite a lot of this surviving evidence, and more is being discovered all the time about the roles that women had, and particularly the lives of these female religious at the time. So you've got, I guess, quite a lot of background detail that you can find out, but I wonder if you could talk about the challenges of imagining yourself into the inner lives of these women, and whether there's a danger of projecting contemporary attitudes onto those characters, and how you sort of guard against that.
Oh, absolutely. There's a danger. And in fact, there are a lot of people who say that it can't be done by modern writers, right? Modern writers can't actually project themselves into especially medieval mindsets because it's so distant. They're so distant from where we are now. Even Henry James didn't love, he actually, in fact, hated historical fiction, because historical fiction to him was always going to be false, because it was trying to ventriloquize another time that is just impossible to do. And so he, very famously to Sarah Orne Jewett, said, live in the present, like the palpable, pulsating present. I think a lot of people have a lot of fear of going into that time and trying to write about it. I honestly, I embraced the idea of speaking in two voices at the same time. I think historical fiction doesn't necessarily exist because there's no such thing as ahistorical fiction, right? So every book is written of the time of its being written, even if it's written 3,000 years into the future or 3,000 years into the past, right? It's always of the current moment, even if the writer is not aware of that. So I knew that I would do as much as I possibly could to replicate some of the mindset, and I wasn't going to get it entirely right? Because I don't know if we can get it entirely right. And in some ways, that's absolutely liberating, because it means that you're not frozen into this preconceived idea of what medieval people were like. But also at the same time, it's very important to do as much work as possible to try as hard as one can to understand what the past was like. So in this particular case, I really struggled. I mean, it's very, very hard, especially medieval women, because unless they were queens and mothers of kings, wives of kings, they really weren't thought of as interesting enough to write about it or to put into the historical record. So knowing the daily life of almost any woman is almost impossible. But there are things that have been gleaned very brilliantly by a lot of academics that we can rely on and we can push against. So I started to try to understand what life would be like without clocks, for instance, without screens, without a lot of the things that mark time And as soon as I paid attention to time, and so the way that time rolled through an abbey in particular, the liturgical time, and the time based on agriculture, and the time based on, you don't know exactly when 12 noon is, but you know when the sun is at its peak, right? And you also know when the specific flowers bloom and close over the course of the day. So there's a lot of real attention being paid to the natural world that I assume that people in Marie de France's time would have paid a great deal of attention to and would have marked time. So that's the way that I sort of came into the medieval mindset as much as I possibly could, was sort of understanding the wheels within wheels of time.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest differences that I always find trying to think about people in any sort of pre-Enlightenment age really is the reality of eternity and the reality of eternal life and spiritual life, that it's not just theoretical for particularly these nuns in this abbey. This is their reality. This is what they believe. They believe absolutely in the devil and in heaven and hell, and that I thought was really interesting how you sort of found your way into that, because Marie, when she is sent to the abbey, she doesn't have much by way of religious faith. She's been sent there to sort of get her out of the way, and yet she finds something that is perhaps not a straightforward conventional religious faith, but she certainly finds it through being part of that environment. Was that something that you had to think a lot about what faith would have meant to these women?
I did think of it a great deal. And as you say, Marie in my book does not actually have the expected understanding of religion and God and the devil and all of those things that one would think that someone like her would have. And I sat with this for a really long time at a certain point, thinking, okay, do I actually need to make her into a fervent believer in order for her to fit into this time frame? But then I thought, in every era, there are people who are idiosyncratic, who don't actually believe in what most people do believe in, who do question a lot, who there are always sociopaths. There are always psychopaths. There are always people who are trained otherwise, either quietly or just are oppositional in their very natures. And so I wanted to open a space for my Marie, who is a little bit more modern in her understanding of God, because again, I wanted to speak in two voices. I wanted the women around her to believe absolutely in the things that they have been taught of the world and of the heavens. And my Marie has space for questioning heresy, actually, in a lot of ways, right? Putting herself at the center of the world as opposed to putting God at the center of the world. And that is sort of her downfall as well.
Yeah, and one of the ways in which she is defiant and unconventional is that throughout the novel, she is referred to by the people around her, including other women, as being unfeminine. She is not conventionally feminine. She is very tall, she's statuesque, she's physically strong, she has this extraordinary intellectual and managerial capacity. And this is something that obviously she turns to her advantage in the story. But I'm curious to know about how you approached this idea of subverting what was considered fitting for a woman and how it fits into ideas of female power, because we've also got the figure of Queen Eleanor, who is a very strong and powerful woman, but in a very different way, in a more sort of conventionally feminine way. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. So the figure of Marie actually came marching into my life when I was researching Hildegard von Bingen, who is this, of course, brilliant polymath nun of Germany. And which, we still listen to her music. For 400 years after she died, they read her medical textbook. So she's this extraordinary mystic and just brilliant human. But there was a seal of Hildegard's where she was depicted as being 40 feet tall. And the nuns around her were at her knees, right? Really tiny and very, very small. And I thought, of course, this was to mean that she was more important than the people around her. But I thought it was hilarious and really beautiful, and sort of a beautiful idea of physicality actually denoting who a person is inside as well. So I made my Marie into a giantess in some ways, right? Someone who doesn't actually fit into the norms of femininity. And of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the most powerful woman of her age, of many ages, born into power, but also married 2 kings, had I think 4 sons who were kings. I mean, she's just an extraordinarily strong person. She advised popes, right? She pulled a lot of the levers of power, and she did it through not only her own force of will, which I wanted to honor because she was just an incredible, smart politician, but she also did it through traditional femininity, right? She was very beautiful, and she was able to be married twice and sort of come closer to power in both ways, in both marriages, by having babies. And so I wanted to oppose my gender conforming Marie with a gender conforming and actually gender surpassing, like not surpassing because you can't surpass being a woman, but she did way more than was even expected of a queen of the time.
Yeah, and they are a remarkable kind of pair of opposites in the book, because they're, as first in the way that the balance of power shifts between the 2 of them throughout the book. And you mentioned there the kings and the Eleanor's sons. And one aspect of the novel that is really striking, and it took me a little while to notice it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that is that there are almost no male nouns or pronouns in the book. It's really clever. I know that, very, very quickly. There are no proper male nouns. None of the kings are given their names, Henry, John, Richard. They're not referred to by name, even when there's something very explicit, like there's a point at which Marie declares that no boy children belonging to the feudal families on the Abbey lands are allowed to live within the Abbey grounds after the age of 11 or 12. But they're not referred to as boys. She says something like all children who are not female. And this, it's almost this not naming of men and boys, it's almost as if they're sort of erased from the narrative. And even the king is referred to as the crown. And he's not, words like brother, father, son, they're not there in the book either. Can you tell us about this choice and what kind of freedom that gave you in the way that you wrote the book?
Yes, this was, I did this in a spirit of absolute glee and joy. There are no male animals in the book either. Men do exist in this world, but they're sort of amorphous shadows undulating across the wall, right? They're not individuals, and they're not seen with clarity or focus on purpose. And this was just because I spent so much of my life, my 3 degrees are all in literature. And if you read enough literature, the history of literature, women have not traditionally been at the center of much for a very long time. I mean, that's changing, I think, now. But, to have women be at the very strong center, so much so that men become supporting characters in the way that women have been in the history of literature, that felt so joyous to me. That was something that really drove my delight in writing this book in Trump's first America.
Yeah, it's really powerful, that idea of erasure. You suddenly, once you notice it, you suddenly think, oh yeah, they don't, even words like priest are kind of not present. They're just, these
Even
men exist.
Jesus, yeah, which is, not historical in any way.
Yes.
Right? Yes, yeah.
The visions are all of the Virgin Mary or female saints. It's an entirely female world. So let's talk then about the representations of love and sex in this book, because even within this very small community of women, there is a whole variety of relationships between the women. There are sexual relationships between them. There are romantic relationships. Marie herself, she has a unrequited love for the Queen. She also has requited loves. She has mutual relationships with other nuns. And I just wondered whether you had found, whether that's something that you had kind of filled in the gaps that were not there in the record, or whether you'd actually found evidence for romantic relationships between these women in these communities.
Really wish that I'd written down the name of the book. If it may come to me in a minute, but there's a book, a really, really, really brilliant book that changed my understanding of sexuality, at least in Abbey's, because there was a line, and it wasn't more than a paragraph, in which the author was talking about lesbianism. And how it doesn't even exist in the historical record, because the people writing history at that time were not only men, they were clerics. Right? So the idea that sex that could exist without a male member, even it couldn't exist, right? It couldn't exist because the male member was the center of sexual experience, and therefore women couldn't do it together. And I thought that was so delightful, like such a delightful idea, such a giant blind spot in the history of sexuality. And it became something that I just took a lot of glee in writing about, and sort of thinking through how relationships would be like if a whole giant subset of sexual relations didn't officially exist, right? And who knows? I mean, there are these stories. Sister Benedetta, I think her name was, who had favorites that she slept with in the same bed. I think she's an Italian nun. But a lot of this was wishful thinking. A lot of this was also thinking of who Marie herself was. And she seems to me that she is just very much an animal in every possible way, in the best possible way. I mean, we're all animals, but some of us, pay homage to our animal natures a little bit more. And she has hunger, right? She has appetite, she's ambition. She will take what she wants, whether or not it's good for herself or her women around her or the world, right? So I really think in this character, who is so selfish in every way, if she had sexual feelings, she would chase them. She's kind of a narcissist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, that idea that of the silence of the Christian scriptures on the idea of same-sex relationships between women, because that's something that was reflected certainly in Britain, in the laws around homosexuality. There wasn't, male homosexuality was illegal until really not that long ago. But there were no laws on female sexuality because the people writing the laws couldn't conceive of it existing. And that's something that Marie wrestles with, the sort of she has guilt around that for a part of the book when she's thinking about these feelings. So she's obviously conscious that it is in some way connected with, feelings that are supposedly forbidden. But I think it's so beautifully imagined, because she also has maternal feelings towards some of the younger nuns, and so it's not all, there's a whole world of relationships even within this this closed community. One thing that I would like to ask you about, which you've touched on earlier, is the relationship between the Abbey and the land. but that's obviously something that interests you and is present in your other books as well. But what we see in Matrix is complex because the community depends on astute use of the land and the water and the livestock in order to survive effectively, but also to increase its profits. And Marie is very good at managing this, but it comes at a price to the natural world, and that's something that you do highlight in the book. And it's no less of a price because it's women doing the building. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where that kind of awareness of the natural world fits in.
Absolutely. So this is maybe a larger question, meaning that it's something that I'm talking about in all three of the books of the triptych that I'm trying to write at the moment. You know, the major question that I wanted to address with all of these books, sort of as I'm skipping a stone through history, it's sort of, you know, starts with Matrix, goes to Westerwilds in 1609. And then the third one that I'm still working on is now. One of the questions that I'm asking is, how did we get to the point we find ourselves, right? How did we come to the absolute brink of climate catastrophe if we're not actually actively falling in? I mean, I look at my friends and family in Los Angeles right now who are just reeling. I mean, my cousin's house burned, right? It's horrible. How did we get here? And there are many things that we can blame. And I don't blame all of religion, but I blame a misreading of Genesis that has been promulgated for millennia, which is, you know, in Genesis, when God is giving Adam and Eve dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, you know, I think dominion is a more nurturing, a more perhaps maternal way of dealing with the world. It's taking care of the world, but we have interpreted it as domination, right? As you know, animals exist so that we can eat them, right? Right. And the ocean is something for cruise ships to dump trash into, as opposed to taking care of the natural world, was the only natural world we have. So I really do trace it back to a misunderstanding of a very basic religious belief that we have just selfishly reinterpreted in the wrong way. And so I really wanted to think about what climate change is. And of course, climate change didn't start in the 20th century, even though we started paying attention to it in the 20th century. Climate change happened when the first human being intentionally burnt the first twig, right? So if you're actively changing the climate around you, you are changing the way that you interact with and love the world around you. So I really wanted to think about, I guess, culpability. I mean, we who are alive today are culpable, but also our ancestors are culpable as well. And abbeys at the time really did do some pretty horrific things to the land. I was just at Royaumont in France, and it's in fenlands, right? It's in a really swampy land that was completely drained. And you think of all of the animals and all the plants that just were eradicated in that area when the swamps were drained 1,000 years ago. So I wanted to think through this idea of religion and the way that religion is sort of interdigitated with climate change.
Yeah, and I think that comes across very clearly in the book, in this idea of the land being something that is there to be used and to yield its kind of riches for the benefit of humans. And we see Marie coming up with all kinds of ingenious building projects, which are part of, she claims are given to her in her visions, but are they coming from her own imagination? We don't know. And one of the things, in fact, one of the building projects that she that she sees in one of her visions that she starts having in later life is, that is so disruptive of the land around her, is the construction of this enormous labyrinth, this labyrinth of roads leading to the Abbey, so that it becomes unapproachable. And it's at this point that there's an element of fairy tale that kind of seeps into it, because you think of these sort of princes trying to approach the tower but being thwarted at every turn. And part of the reason for the labyrinth is to keep the outside world out and keep this island of women safe. But this idea of myth and legend, it's there throughout the book. Marie's royal genealogy is supposed to include an enchantress, and there are always these whispers of magic that attend women with power. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where the idea for the labyrinth came from, and also this idea of the slightly mythical and magical that is there at the edges of the story.
Oh, well, I actually believe that people probably did live within the magical more than we do now, or within an embrace of the magical, possibly. I mean, the Plantagenet family was said to have descended from Melusina, right? The mythical, I don't even, is she a mermaid? I don't know. She turns into a fish,
yes,
at night when she bathes. And so there is magic in them, apparently. So this, I wanted to take as much as possible from the historical record, but also from anecdotes and from apocryphal understandings of the time. And there's this apocryphal story, this really beautiful story, where, of course, Eleanor of Aquitaine's husband, second husband, Henry, had this beautiful mistress named Rosamond. And in order to keep him from Eleanor, who was portrayed throughout the land as a dragon wife, right? She was this terrible person. But the story goes that he built this little labyrinth around his beloved, and Eleanor somehow snuck in and poured poison into her ear and killed her, right? And the truth is probably he did keep his mistress in some place far from Eleanor, and she died young of one of the millions of, unvaccinated diseases that existed then. But I love that it sort of, it speaks to the understanding of the relationship between Henry and Eleanor. It speaks to the understanding of the world as a world in which magic does exist and can be easily accessed. And storytelling is magical, right? I mean, when one tells a story, one is engaging in this atavistic, joyous magic. And so I wanted to bring that into the book. And of course, there is no evidence of a labyrinth around any of the abbeys in England of the time. But I did, while I was writing this book, I saw in The Guardian, there's this beautiful article about, at the time there was a drought happening in England. And there were these extraordinary pictures taken from the sky, from a drone or a plane or something. As people were looking down, as you were looking down, you could see the tracery of the foundations of medieval abbeys, of structures that had been there and were gone for centuries, if not millennia, right? And so the idea that the land remembers, even when we forget that there have been structures there have been people who've lived on this land. I thought that was really powerful. And at one point, in one of the drafts of this book, there was a contemporary moment where sort of the labyrinth sort of rose up in a drought, and you could see it, but that was erased in one of the many edits. But I still love this idea.
But that image is there in one of Marie's visions, because she has a couple of visions that are somewhat apocalyptic, that show, I mean, it's as if she's been watching the news, she sees vast wildfires, but she also sees these burnt outlines on the dry ground. And I found that really gave me the shivers, just that, because I remember that news story of the foundations coming up. And of course, the labyrinth, there are labyrinths set into kind of cathedral floors, and I was thinking about Chartres and whether that was kind of particularly symbolic to you, these
Yes.
ideas. Yeah.
Oh, I just want to say this is the most exciting thing for me. Nobody's brought this up, I think, ever, but yes. So the labyrinth in Chartres was actually something that I kept seeing everywhere when you're writing a book. And when you write a novel, and there's this portal that opens, and suddenly the whole world is speaking back into you, right? And so that that you're on the right piece, at least. That's what was happening with the labyrinth. And so just in terms of the sheer structure of the book, in some ways, the structure is a unicursal labyrinth, right? There's Marie going through her life, sort of, I guess, labyrinths, especially the one in Chartres, is about a pilgrim going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, right? So you go through and whatever. But that was actually, her life. We see almost the entirety of her life in linear form, and sort of circles and circles and circles. At the same time, I have a second structure, which goes back to one of your earlier questions, which is I had a really beautiful conversation with another writer friend. And she said, did you ever notice that the standard structure of a novel with a rising action, climax, denouement is a male orgasm? And I'm like, I never noticed that, right? I mean, okay, fair enough. And so I thought, what would the female alternative be, right? And in some ways, it's episodic, right? It's a rosary, right? So those are the two structures that I was thinking of when I was building the book. It was a labyrinth, a unicursal labyrinth, but also,
yes, lots of peaks and troughs, if you're lucky. So Marie,
I said this in Germany, and a lady walked out because she said it was not appropriate. So I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I hope we haven't lost anyone. We might have gained a few people. Women's literacy and education is a huge priority for Marie throughout the book. She introduces a scriptorium to the Abbey, which didn't exist before, where the nuns copy and illuminate these holy texts. And as you mentioned before with the illustrations, this is contentious because there were strong views about what women are or are not permitted to read at the time, and it was men deciding that. And you are living, but I say you particularly in America because it's not quite as bad here, but you are living through a time when men in power are deciding what people can and can't read. And you've recently taken a stand against that by opening your own bookshop, The Links. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that project and how it came about, and what your mission for the bookshop is.
So I had wanted to open a bookshop for years and years and years. We didn't have one in my university town of 250,000 people, and it's a town without a bookshop is a town without a soul. I believe that very deeply. Then my family and I were at the American Academy in Berlin for 6 months when the state of Florida opened up the rules so that anyone could ban a book, basically in public schools and public libraries. Anyone. You don't have to have a child in the public schools to ban the book. You just have to live in the area. And that opened a spate of book bannings that was so offensive and massive. At this point, there are over 6,000 individual titles in the state of Florida that are banned variously throughout the state. So when we were in Germany, Germans kept sort of sidling up to us with deep earnestness and saying, you have to stop this now, right? If you do not stop this now, we know where it goes, right? Yeah. This is the point of the spear of authoritarianism. And actually, they would say, dort wo man Buchen verbrennt man auch am Ende Menschen. So in the places where books are burnt, they will one day burn people. And so that's chilling, right? That's chilling to hear, really that's chilling to understand. And so when we came back, we did it. We opened Bookshop for multiple reasons. One is, I think, right now it's public libraries and public schools where books are being banned. private industry, because Republicans love private business, are not the places where books are being banned, but it's very, very, very important for people to see representations of themselves, right? It's really important. And so to have a space where you can go and you can find books that sort of speak into your life and into the actual history that's happening. That's also like Black history is being banned in the state of Florida. So it's horrific. But there's that. But then there's also the case that if and when, and I think it's an issue of when in Florida, booksellers are going to be targeted for selling books. I want to be the one who's arrested, right? Because I have a big microphone, and I can be really loud and really get into Ron DeSantis's face. So I might as well be the one selling, the gay books to the little gay Floridian children, and letting that happen and being arrested for it. And we also have a nonprofit too, which donates tens of thousands of dollars worth of books, banned books, to Floridians, just to keep them in the public fabric, to keep them things like The Handmaid's Tale, things like all of Toni Morrison's books, things like Othello, things like Goodnight Moon. These are being banned and challenged.
Yeah, it's genuinely extraordinary. And do you have public events as well? Do you have? Are you able to put on talks and that?
Yeah, three or four a week. Yeah, we do a number. Yes.
And what are the challenges of running a bookshop alongside your writing career? I mean, has it impacted your ability to spend time writing and researching and traveling, or I mean, has that become a sort of main focus for you?
Yeah, I'm split into many different people right now, but one of the people that I have built a citadel around is the writer self. And so the writer self gets up at 5 a.m, no matter what, and writes straight through until she's done. And I'm very protective of that time and that space. So yes, I am writing. I'm not writing particularly well, but I'm still writing, right? I'm still showing up and doing the work. I have luckily found brilliant people to manage the store. So I'm not doing the day-to-day management. I'm just paying all the bills, which is, stressful in and of itself. But I do have a great staff who take care of most of the things that I don't want to deal with. And I think, if you have multiple jobs, and I have multiple jobs right now, right? I've got my traveling, I've got my my writing, I've got my children, I've got every single job on the planet at the moment. I think it's good if one can hire people to do the things one does not do well.
It makes me think of Marie, actually, because one of her talents, when she comes to the Abbey initially, and it's a mess, and the nuns are literally starving. One of her great talents is to hire the right people for the job, or to appoint the right women with the talents to manage different departments of the Abbey, and that's really when it begins to thrive. So I wondered if you kind of felt a bit of sympathy for her with that, having to oversee all these different roles.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And actually, one of the things that just struck me in what you were saying, talking about keeping, fencing off your writing time, just quickly before we go over to questions, but one of the things that is really apparent in the book is that there is very little privacy. It is such a communal life, obviously in the Abbey, but also even people who are not in the religious life. People share rooms. Very few people have a room of one's own, and Marie sort of craves that, and yet she is never given alone time. She has to steal the time when she writes for that. I wondered how much of yourself is kind of in that idea of sort of having to try and steal time in the night to write, and that longing for privacy that we all have as writers, but also the fear of it.
Oh, yes. Well, not only was there no privacy and no ability to have things of one's own in these abbeys, people didn't even read silently to themselves, right? Reading, they all read out loud, which is just astonishing to me, because one of the great joys and beauties of being a reader now is to build these private universes. Every book sort of adds to the private, beautiful universe that you're creating. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, as you know, being a very busy writer, also, just the exigencies of being alive are enough some days, right? To let alone adding work that you care so deeply about. It's just so much. It's just a lot. I have to say, when I was 19, I decided that writing would be the center of my life. And I say this even around my children, so they know this, which means that everything sort of has to conform to the writing. And so far it's worked because they understand it. My husband understands it. And now the employees of the Links understand it as well.
I'm going to just see, I think we've got a few questions coming in. Please do continue to send questions for Lauren from wherever you are watching. And let me just take a little look and see what we've got here. I've got a question from Malgazata, who says, thank you, Lauren and Stephanie. I have a question about contemporary. Do you think, Lauren, that we can interpret medieval women's works using contemporary methodological tools, such as feminist concepts? Can we apply those to medieval thought, which was based on a very different recognition of the world?
That's a brilliant question. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's, it's what we touched on before about that, the idea of trying to, whether you can judge these women's lives by the contemporary yardsticks that we have today. And I mean, I've certainly heard other writers who write historical fiction say that they have sometimes been, I know Sarah Perry has said this, she writes about she's written about Victorian women, but people say that readers have said to her, oh, your women are too, they're too independent minded, they're too, they're too sort of self-aware and too kind of feminist. But actually, if you look back at the record, you will find there are always, as you said earlier, there are always women who have defied conventions and defied what was expected of them. You've just got to sort of find those stories in the gaps. So I'm not sure that there is that much, I guess, that much difference. What do you think?
Like all tools, literary theory or literary frameworks to reread the past have some problematic elements to them. I mean, but I think the more ways that we read the past, possibly the better, right? As long as we understand that there's no one single right way, but there are a plethora of interesting ways to fill in the gaps. I think a lot about Sadia Hartman, who's this, MacArthur genius, and she writes a lot about, she goes into the archives, she calls it critical fabulation, and she tries to breathe life into the lives of people who've been lost to history, right? Maybe only their names exist in some sort of record, and they tend to be young enslaved Black women in particular. She's spent some time thinking through that. Wayward Lives is one of her amazing books. And I love this. It's not the only way to encounter the past, right? There are hundreds of different ways to do it. But I love that because it's reasserting the importance of people who were not deemed important, right? So I think any tool that we use, as long as we use it humbly, with understanding that there are many other correct ways of reading, and maybe some of those correct ways are contradictory to our own. I think, I don't know if we can, from the 21st century, fully understand the past, but I think the more we try, the closer we'll come.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what. Oh, okay. So this is a question that I was meaning to ask you anyway, but this has come in from Christine. When reading Matrix last year, I kept thinking what an amazing movie it would make. Can we look forward to seeing this story on screen?
Oh man. So one of my favorite artists, her name is Heidi Schreck. She wrote What the Constitution Means to Me. It's this one and a half woman play. She won the Pulitzer for it. She optioned it for a 9-part Netflix series. And I don't know why it didn't get made, but she's so brilliant. It was the best treatment I've ever read of any of my work. So at the moment, no, because the option has fallen out, but perhaps in the future it would be fun. That said, I have to say I'm ambivalent about seeing my own work on screen. It's never happened, so I may not be ambivalent in the future if it does happen. But I do think when you read a book, you're bringing 50% as the reader to the book, right? So you're putting faces of people that you love onto the faces of the characters, right? You're building this world based on what you know and what you've lived. And so it's unique to you. Every book, when it meets you, becomes unique. But when something is filmed and put on the screen, suddenly the imagination shrinks to a monoculture, right? So it's a single vision of what had been so beautifully multipartite. So possibly I'd be excited. Possibly I'd be devastated. At this point, though, the book is not mine anymore. So meaning once it gets into the reader's hands, it's theirs. So I don't know if I even have much of a say.
Oh, I think it would be the most extraordinary because it's so episodic, as you were saying, and what a phenomenal array of characters to draw from for actors to get their teeth into. I think it would be wonderful. So please, if any producers are watching, please do something with that. So Lucia asks, can you talk a bit about your writing process and the stages of creating a new book? And also, are you drawn at all towards any fantasy genre or any other genre that you haven't attempted yet?
The genre comes to me with the book project, so I never say no. It's everything is wide open. I'm not actively seeking out how to write anything at the moment. I'm writing 4 or 5 things at the moment. None of them are genre. So here's my process, and it's insane. And if you're a writer, my apologies. You don't have to do this, right? I'm just saying that this is what I do. So I write multiple projects at once, and I love to do that because when I wake up in the morning, I'm still dreaming. I have my cup of coffee, and I get started on the thing that my subconscious has been working on all night. And it's urgent, it's exciting, it's hot, right? You go where the heat is. Well, with most of my books in particular, not most of my short stories, some of them, I give myself a specific amount of time to do research, and it's as joyous as possible. It's wide. You go down every wormhole. I go nuts, right? And I read 10 to 12 hours a day on this, whatever it is. At the end of that time, I do a really fast draft and I write everything longhand because I believe it's really, really, really important to write longhand. Just for me. So physiologically, if I'm on my computer, I'm pushing the work away. Work on the screen looks almost finished, so I'm not as free, right? It feels set in stone in a specific way. I'm tempted to keep things that are beautiful to the ear, but maybe don't work in the book. So when I do a fast draft, all I'm doing is sort of experimenting, and I'm figuring out sort of the contours of the characters and the story that I'm trying to tell. And then I put it aside, I put it into a banker's box. I use these huge Muji notebooks, and then I'd never read it again. I don't care about reading it again because it's really what exists in the mind that really matters, right? And what has been developed in the mind through the process of writing this first draft. And then I do a second draft, third draft. Right now, in the book I'm working on, I'm in the process of handwriting probably a 20th draft at this point. I've lost complete count. I have no idea how many pages I have, poor trees that I've killed putting into this book. But the thing is, the reason I do this is because I'm a very impatient person and it forces patience on me, right? And I have some OCD issues. And so doing free drafts that I'm not going to read again keeps me moving forward and doesn't stop me in a sentence for 3 months, which otherwise could happen. But the other thing too is I have such profound and almost mystical belief in the subconscious, because the subconscious is where all of the work gets done, to be honest. The things that we do with the front of the brain, the things that we do to reread are not as interesting than as the things that are being done, being worked through as we're going for a walk or taking a shower or taking just time to stare out the window, right? That's the important part. So eventually then I'll put it on the screen, and that's when I do the really fine sentence work, which I love so much. I started as a poet, and I love the sound of words. I love the etymology of words, right? I love everything about words. And then it goes off to my readers, and then there's another 2 to 3 years until the book comes out. So
Wow.
yeah, that's it. But nobody has to do that but me,
No.
right? I'm not telling you to do. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it clearly it works. So overall, that's sort of 5 years or so, but on a project, would you say? I love this idea that handwriting brings you closer, physically closer to the project.
Yes.
Because yeah, and I guess it would slow you down.
Oh yes.
And
well, I have to, just physically, like, I'm sorry, not to interrupt. I'm so sorry I interrupted you. I really, in my whole body, don't know anything about the medieval age, right? I don't know anything about 1609 in Jamestown, but I do know what it's like to be an animal in the world, right? I do know what it's like to hold a bowl of warm soup, right? I know that, and so my characters can know that. So the more we make the writing process physical and not out of the ego/intelligence, I think the better. At least for me.
It's such an interesting approach, and I love that what you were saying about language, because there is so much beautiful language that you've been able to bring in from the medieval, some of it from the French, from the medieval French, some of it from medieval English, and these little words kind of dropped throughout that give the whole thing this feeling of being of another time. So I've got a question here from Elizabeth, who says, in her prologue, Marie de France speaks with great confidence about her writing. Do you have a favorite lay, and did it feed into your novel?
Oh, I love all the lay. I tried to actually do, for people who love Marie de France, I tried to put little Easter eggs in throughout. So you may recognize certain characters from the lay in the book, or I don't know. It's just I try to enjoy myself when I write. I do. Let me see. I really love Le Rossignol. I like Guimard. I like them all, right? They're all just bonkers. They're all incredible. Do you have a favorite, Stephanie?
Do you know, I'm not particularly familiar with Marie, with her original writings. So no, I mean, it's not, I haven't written in that period, but I love it. And so I learned a huge amount from this book. My mother actually did a PhD in medieval French, started a PhD in medieval French poetry. So so I feel that is, that's a bit of a, but I'm going to go and read as a result of this. I'm now going to seek out the originals. To go back to on the same theme, Catherine asks, please can you tell us more about the queer werewolf story?
I can, but I actually think it's better if people read the lay themselves. I really think it's important to find these stories in as close an approximation to the language that Marie herself used. Yeah. So go buy the book. Go read it. You're going to love it. It's so weird and wonderful. It's really incredible.
Fantastic. This is an interesting question from Eilish, which we sort of vaguely touched on, but I think there's a lot more to say about it. She asks, how did you go about researching what femininity looked like in this time? And was femininity, in quotes, something that was actually prized in the way we do now, considering that women did have to play many of the same roles as men?
I do believe femininity, especially when you read about Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? Power and femininity. It was prized in a different way, but even if you read Marie, there is a conflation of beauty, feminine beauty with goodness. Not always, not constantly, but very frequently. And when people are described as fair, it's not just fair in physicality, it's some sort of emanation out of the beauty of their soul as well. It tends to be. So I find that I am not an expert for sure on performance of gender in the medieval times, but I do, from what I've read, I do think women who were born into women's bodies there was a great deal of pressure, especially if they were people of the upper classes to be feminine. That said, the only people of the time really who were educated, who were women, were people of the upper classes, right? Because they had to take care of these vast estates when the men were off, killing, people in the Middle East, right? So these were the women who were numerate, right? They were literate. They were in charge of the people working the land. They had to understand the needs of the land. So the people who ran giant estates were really extraordinary. And it was a different time, obviously, right? The marriages were between families. They weren't between individuals per se. So beauty, physical beauty was an attribute that was sellable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess that's one way in which things have not necessarily changed.
That's true.
For the better. So this is an interesting question from Valerie, which I also would have wished I'd asked more about. She asks, what do you make of medieval women's religious visions? They seemed to believe in them as true revelations. And I wonder if I can also tie that in with asking how the life of Hildegard influenced you in writing about Marie, because I know that that's something that, because Marie's visions start in later life. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those mystical visions and what they meant to your character.
Oh gosh, I went down so many rabbit holes in terms of the mystical visions, because I do believe the vast majority of mystics truly believe these visions, right? They were truly gifts from heaven, from God. I do also believe that maybe that is one of the very real definitions of genius, which is to take abstractions and turn them into material good, right? So Hildegard von Bingen, through her mysticism, through her very powerful visions that were handed to her postmenopausal, she was able to build for her nuns this abbey. She was able to become the interlocutor in the sort of, she corresponded with kings and popes. She brought a great deal of power to herself through these gifts from God, and actually material wealth as well, right? Her abbey did really well because of these mystical visions. So it's not my place to say whether or not they were real, but the benefits from having these mystical visions really were enormous for some of these mystics, Hildegard in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it just made me think of, there's an episode in one of the Hilary Mantel Thomas Cromwell books, and I can't remember, I think it might be Bring Up the Bodies, I forget which one, but there is a young woman who is a prophetess, and she's from, you know, I guess we would call, you know, she's from a working family, she's not educated, but she has these extraordinary visions, and she is therefore being manipulated by all the male religious clerics around her, and it's very clearly you know, one way for this young woman to appropriate power. And you've got a sort of similar a similar incident that happens in Matrix, where there's a young woman who claims to also to be having visions, and it is, I guess, one way in which women could attract, you know, attract followers and attract donations, and so I guess these visions were a source of power. I think that we are coming up to the end of our time, and I think that's all of the questions that have come in. Lauren, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for going back into your research for this wonderful novel. It's one of those novels that really, within about a chapter of reading, I just thought, I wish I'd written this. This is one of those books that I just have so much admiration and love for this book. It's just wonderful. So if anybody is watching who has not yet read it, please do go and buy Matrix and, of course, Lauren's other books. And if you are in the UK or likely to be in the UK, the Medieval Women exhibition at the British Library is running until the 2nd of March. So please do go and have a look at some of the original materials for finding out what these communities of women were up to in the Middle Ages. And thank you all again for joining us. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you so much.